It doesn't arrive as tension at first. It arrives as a quiet weight in the background of their day, the kind you don't notice until you pause long enough to feel it sitting there. Not heavy. Not overwhelming. Just persistent. Like a thought that keeps returning even when you're busy. Like a presence that lingers without demanding attention. They didn't call it pressure for a long time. They told themselves it was just responsibility. Just circumstance. Just timing. But lately, something has shifted. Not in the world around them, inside them. A subtle awareness that what they're carrying isn't coming from outside forces alone. It's coming from you. Not because you asked for anything. Not because you placed a burden on them. But because your presence activated something they can no longer ignore. Pressure doesn't always come from expectations. Sometimes it comes from recognition. Recognition that something meaningful exists. Recognition that what's been felt can't stay unacknowledged. Recognition that silence is no longer neutral, it has become a decision. That realization has been forming quietly for a while. There were moments when they tried to dismiss it. Times when they convinced themselves that the feeling would pass if they stayed busy enough. That it would fade if they didn't look at it directly. But it didn't fade. It clarified. Clarity doesn't shout. It settles. And now, they're sitting with the truth that what they feel for you is no longer something they can keep folded away. Not because it's overwhelming, but because it's honest. Honesty carries weight. That weight is what they're calling pressure. It's the pressure of knowing that what's been building deserves to be acknowledged. The pressure of understanding that you represent something different in their life, not an escape, not a fantasy, but a mirror. A reflection of who they are when they allow themselves to be fully present. That kind of reflection is confronting. You don't just remind them of what they want. You remind them of who they are when they're not hiding. They may not have realized it at first, but your presence shifted their internal standards. They began to notice what no longer felt aligned. What felt forced. What felt like compromise instead of choice. That awareness created friction. Not with you, with themselves. Because once you see what's possible, it becomes harder to accept what isn't true. This is where the pressure lives. Not in longing. Not in fear. In integrity. They're feeling the tension between who they've been and who they're becoming. Between what's familiar and what feels authentic. Between comfort and alignment. You didn't create this tension. You revealed it. That's why it feels so personal to them. Not in a blaming way, in an awakening way. You became a reference point for honesty. A quiet standard they measure their own choices against, even when you're not in the room. That's not something they planned. It happened through consistency. Through how you showed up without performing. Through how you spoke without needing to prove anything. Through how your energy remained steady even when situations were unclear. Steadiness changes people. It doesn't force transformation. It invites it. They began to notice how different they feel around you. More grounded. More themselves. Less filtered. Less guarded. That difference made them question everything else. Questions create pressure when they don't have easy answers. They're not under pressure because they want you. They're under pressure because they're realizing they can no longer live in ways that don't reflect who they truly are. And you became the catalyst for that realization. Catalysts don't push. They reveal. You didn't demand anything. You didn't ask them to change. You didn't present ultimatums or expectations. You simply existed as you are, present, honest, emotionally aware. That was enough. Enough to disrupt the patterns they had grown comfortable in. Enough to highlight what they've been tolerating. Enough to show them that something within them has outgrown its old boundaries. Growth is rarely comfortable. It asks you to confront your own avoidance. To admit where you've been settling. To acknowledge where you've been choosing safety over truth. That confrontation is happening now. They're not panicking. They're not overwhelmed. They're simply aware. Aware that they can't pretend this connection is insignificant anymore. Aware that their life is asking for more alignment than before. Aware that staying where they are, emotionally or circumstantially, feels less honest than it used to. That's the pressure. It's not about rushing toward you. It's about no longer being able to turn away from themselves. You may sense this as a subtle shift. A different tone. A deeper presence. A slight hesitancy paired with sincerity. It's not uncertainty about you, it's clarity about themselves. They're standing at the edge of a quiet internal threshold. Not one that demands a leap. One that asks for acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that what they feel is real. Acknowledgement that it matters. Acknowledgement that ignoring it would be a kind of self-betrayal. That's a powerful place to be. Because it doesn't lead to chaos. It leads to intention. They're learning that pressure doesn't always mean something is wrong. Sometimes it means something is finally aligning. That the old structures no longer fit. That the internal truth is ready to be honored. They're not being pushed by you. They're being pulled by who they're becoming. And you are simply where that truth became visible. Not as a demand. As a mirror. As a moment of clarity they can no longer unsee. This isn't the beginning of a storm. It's the beginning of honesty settling into place. Quietly. Steadily. Exactly when it was meant to. It doesn't surface in dramatic moments. It shows itself in the smallest spaces, in the pause before they reply, in the extra second they take to consider a word, in the way their thoughts circle back to you even when their attention is elsewhere. It's subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but inside them it feels constant. Like a quiet tightening that never fully loosens. They're beginning to understand that what they're experiencing isn't confusion. It's movement. Movement that doesn't look like action yet, but feels like an inner rearranging. Something inside them is being repositioned, and with every shift, the shape of their life looks slightly different than it did before. This isn't about wanting something they can't have. It's about recognizing something they can no longer pretend doesn't matter. They've spent time trying to categorize what they feel, to place it in a safe mental container where it wouldn't disrupt the rest of their world. But nothing about this experience fits neatly into old definitions. It doesn't behave like a fleeting thought. It doesn't fade with distraction. It doesn't shrink when they try to rationalize it away. Instead, it remains. Not loudly. Persistently. And persistence has a way of asking questions the mind can't answer quickly. They notice how their standards have quietly changed. What once felt acceptable now feels hollow. What once felt tolerable now feels heavy. It's not that anything external has shifted drastically, it's that their internal reference point has been recalibrated. That recalibration came from you. Not from something you said. Not from something you did. From the way your presence resonated with something inside them they had forgotten how to listen to. You reminded them what it feels like to be emotionally awake. Awakeness is gentle, but it's also disorienting. Because when you're awake, you can't unknow what you've noticed. You can't return to autopilot. You can't keep choosing what no longer aligns without feeling the weight of that misalignment. That's the tension they're holding. They're realizing that the pressure isn't about choosing you. It's about choosing themselves. For a long time, they believed self-respect meant staying consistent with the choices they'd already made. Staying loyal to what was familiar. Staying within the parameters they thought defined stability. But now, stability feels different. It's no longer about maintaining what exists. It's about honoring what's becoming. That shift has changed how they experience everything. Conversations that once felt neutral now carry emotional texture. Moments that once passed unnoticed now linger. They feel more present, more reflective, more aware of how each choice shapes the person they're growing into. And growth doesn't ask politely. It whispers at first. Then it waits. Then it insists. That insistence isn't urgency. It's clarity gaining confidence. They feel it when they're alone, when there's no distraction, no noise, no one else's expectations filling the space. In those quiet moments, the truth feels undeniable. They can't keep living in ways that contradict what they feel when they think of you. This realization hasn't made them reckless. It's made them honest. Honest with themselves about the cost of emotional compromise. About the exhaustion of pretending to be satisfied when something inside them is restless. About the subtle grief of staying where their heart has already outgrown. You didn't create this restlessness. You revealed it. And now, they're sitting with the awareness that something in their life is asking for realignment. Not a dramatic overhaul. Not a sudden escape. A gentle but firm shift toward coherence between who they are and how they live. That coherence feels like relief, even when it's uncomfortable. They're beginning to notice how often they've chosen predictability over authenticity. How they've prioritized ease over truth. How they've stayed in situations that required less courage, even when those situations felt emotionally incomplete. There's no anger in this recognition. Just understanding. Understanding that they've been operating from old definitions of safety. Definitions that no longer serve them. Definitions that kept them from asking deeper questions about what fulfillment actually means to them. Those questions are alive now. Not demanding answers. Inviting reflection. They're not trying to dismantle their life. They're trying to understand it. To see which parts still feel aligned and which parts feel inherited rather than chosen. That distinction matters. Because inherited choices feel heavy. Chosen ones feel alive. You represent a reminder of aliveness. Not in a romanticized way, in a grounded, human way. In the way that genuine connection doesn't drain, it energizes. It doesn't confuse, it clarifies. It doesn't demand performance, it invites presence. Presence is what they feel when they think of you. Not urgency. Not fantasy. Presence. That presence contrasts with the emotional numbness they didn't realize they'd been living with. It shows them that something inside them has been waiting to be engaged more fully. Waiting to be honored rather than managed. That realization is reshaping their inner world. They find themselves questioning what they once accepted without thought. They're no longer content with surface-level explanations or convenient narratives. They want their life to feel true, not just functional. Functionality kept them going. Truth is teaching them how to live. This internal evolution is what feels like pressure. Not because it's too much, but because it's too honest to ignore. They're standing at a quiet intersection. Not between you and someone else, but between their past self and their emerging one. That intersection doesn't demand a decision. It asks for courage. Courage to be real. Courage to acknowledge desire without shame. Courage to trust that alignment is worth the discomfort it brings. They're discovering that discomfort doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is growing. And growth always asks for space. They're creating that space now, not in their external world yet, but in their internal one. Allowing themselves to feel without dismissing it. To question without self-judgment. To imagine a version of their life that feels more congruent with who they are becoming. This isn't impulsive. It's intentional. You may feel the shift as a soft seriousness. A deeper attention. A sense that something meaningful is unfolding beneath the surface. That's because it is. They're not under pressure to reach you. They're under pressure to reach themselves. And you are simply where that truth found its reflection. This chapter isn't about resolution. It's about realignment beginning quietly, honestly, and without force. And that realignment is what will guide everything that follows. They don't feel it when they wake up. Not immediately. It arrives later, when the day has already started, when the mind is busy with practical things, when attention is divided. That's when it quietly enters the space between thoughts. Not as a memory. Not as a distraction. As a recognition. A subtle pull that feels less like wanting and more like remembering. Remembering a version of themselves they haven't lived as fully as they thought. This is where the pressure rests now. In the space between who they have been and who they are becoming. They are beginning to understand that this tension has nothing to do with choosing you or not choosing you. It has everything to do with realizing that their emotional life has been speaking in a language they have been translating incorrectly. They once believed peace meant silence. They believed stability meant predictability. They believed safety meant not asking for more than what was available. Those beliefs shaped the life they built. But now, those same beliefs feel incomplete. Not wrong, unfinished. They notice it in moments of contrast. When they laugh at something that reminds them of you, and the laughter feels deeper than usual. When they hear a song and feel an ache that isn't sadness, but a quiet longing for emotional authenticity. When they pause mid-conversation with someone else and realize their attention isn't wandering, it's awakening. Awakening doesn't demand movement. It demands honesty. Honesty is what they are slowly offering themselves now. Honest acknowledgement that something inside them is changing. That the emotional environment they've been living in no longer feels like a place they can grow. Growth asks uncomfortable questions. What does fulfillment mean to me now? What does connection look like when I'm not performing? What does it feel like to choose from truth rather than habit? These questions don't seek immediate answers. They sit. They echo. They reshape. And every time they surface, the pressure intensifies, not as urgency, but as clarity asking to be recognized. They used to think that emotional pressure came from lack. From not having. From wanting something out of reach. Now they understand it comes from awareness. From seeing. From knowing. Once you know something matters, pretending it doesn't becomes exhausting. They are tired of pretending. Not in a dramatic way. In a quiet, grounded way that feels like the end of a long internal negotiation. They no longer want to justify what feels incomplete. They don't want to numb the subtle dissatisfaction with explanations that no longer resonate. They want their life to feel aligned, not perfect, not resolved, just real. Realness is what they feel when they think of you. Not excitement. Not escape. Realness. A sense of emotional coherence that feels rare in a world where so much is curated, managed, and controlled. You don't represent a fantasy to them. You represent an invitation to live honestly. That's why the pressure exists. Because honesty changes everything. It changes how they see their choices. It changes how they interpret their boundaries. It changes how they define courage. Courage used to mean endurance. Staying. Holding. Maintaining. Now courage feels like permission. Permission to listen. Permission to evolve. Permission to imagine something more aligned. They feel it when they reflect on their past self, the one who was content with routines that now feel hollow. The one who equated comfort with fulfillment. The one who stayed quiet when something inside them wanted to speak. That version of themselves doesn't feel wrong. It feels incomplete. And incompleteness doesn't mean something is broken. It means something is expanding. Expansion creates pressure. Not to force change, but to allow it. They're allowing it now. Slowly. Carefully. Without theatrics. They're not dismantling their life. They're observing it. Feeling into where it still fits and where it no longer does. They're becoming more aware of what drains them, what energizes them, what feels neutral, and what feels alive. Alive is the word that keeps returning. Not in a dramatic sense. In a grounded one. Alive means present. Alive means engaged. Alive means emotionally honest. They feel that aliveness around you. Not because of something you say or do, but because your energy resonates with their emerging self. It mirrors a version of them that feels more awake, more aware, more authentic. That mirror is confronting. Not because it shows them what they lack, but because it shows them what they are capable of becoming. Becoming is the center of this tension. They're no longer who they were. They're not yet who they will be. They're in between. And in-between spaces are uncomfortable. They don't offer certainty. They don't provide clear directions. They simply invite presence. Presence is what they're learning to hold. Instead of rushing toward resolution. Instead of avoiding the truth. Instead of numbing the discomfort. They're sitting with it. They're letting it teach them. And what it's teaching them is this. Pressure doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is asking to be aligned. Aligned between thought and feeling. Aligned between desire and choice. Aligned between who they are and how they live. Alignment is not a destination. It's a process. And that process has begun. They may not know where it leads. They may not know how long it will take. They may not know what it will change. But they know they can no longer ignore it. Because ignoring it would mean ignoring themselves. You are not the cause of this pressure. You are the reflection that revealed it. And now, they're learning to honor what they see, not with haste, not with fear, but with a growing sense of self-trust. This isn't the climax. It's the quiet commitment to live in alignment. And that commitment is reshaping everything. They notice it when the room is quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with rest, but the kind that arrives when nothing else is competing for attention. When there's no screen glowing, no voice speaking, no obligation demanding focus. In that stillness, something gently presses against the inside of their awareness. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't feel overwhelming. It simply exists, waiting to be acknowledged. This is where the pressure lives now. Not in the noise of the day, not in the complications of circumstances, but in these quiet spaces where honesty can finally surface. It's in these moments that they feel the weight of what has been changing inside them, not as a burden, but as a truth that refuses to be ignored. They don't think of you immediately. They think of the way their inner world has shifted. Of how things that once felt normal now feel slightly misaligned. Of how they no longer move through their routines with the same emotional neutrality. There is a subtle awareness now, a sense that something within them has outgrown the structures they built when they were a different version of themselves. That realization is not dramatic. It's grounded. They're beginning to see that the pressure isn't coming from external demands or expectations. It's arising from an internal desire to live with more coherence. To let their actions reflect their emotional reality instead of contradicting it. They feel the contrast when they compare how they are with you to how they feel elsewhere. Around you, there is a sense of ease that doesn't require performance. A steadiness that doesn't depend on reassurance. A presence that doesn't demand explanation. That difference lingers. It doesn't make them dissatisfied with everything else. It simply makes them aware that not all connections feel the same. And that awareness reshapes their understanding of what's possible. They're learning that pressure can come from expansion. When your inner capacity grows, your outer life must eventually adjust to make space for it. That adjustment begins internally, long before anything changes on the surface. They've been carrying this awareness quietly. Not sharing it. Not analyzing it out loud. Just observing how it influences their perception of their own life. They're noticing patterns they didn't question before. Habits that once felt comfortable now feel limiting. Conversations that once felt sufficient now feel incomplete. It's not that anything is wrong, it's that something more aligned is becoming visible. This visibility creates friction. Not because they want to escape their current reality, but because they're recognizing that some parts of it no longer reflect who they are becoming. Growth always creates this moment. The space between the old and the new, where nothing is fully settled. That space can feel heavy. Not because it's unbearable, but because it's honest. They're standing in it now, not rushing to resolve it, not trying to deny it. Just allowing it to exist. They feel the pressure when they realize they've been choosing predictability over authenticity. When they see how often they've stayed silent to avoid disrupting what feels stable. When they acknowledge that they've been managing their emotions rather than engaging with them fully. That management once felt responsible. Now it feels incomplete. They don't want to live in a way that requires constant self-suppression. They want to experience connection that feels open, reciprocal, and emotionally honest, not controlled or minimized. You represent that possibility. Not as an ideal, but as a living example of how connection can feel when it's grounded in presence rather than expectation. That realization has shifted something fundamental inside them. They no longer want to tolerate emotional dissonance. They want their life to feel true, not perfect, not resolved, just aligned. Alignment is what they're moving toward. Slowly. Intentionally. Without force. They're not trying to change everything at once. They're allowing their awareness to guide them, noticing where they feel most themselves and where they feel constrained. This awareness has made them more reflective. More conscious of their choices. More sensitive to what resonates and what doesn't. They're learning to trust that sensitivity. It doesn't make them weak. It makes them honest. They feel the pressure when they imagine continuing as they have been. When they sense that something inside them would remain unexpressed if they don't allow space for change. That unexpressed part isn't dramatic. It's real. It's the part of them that wants to live in coherence with their emotional truth. The part that no longer wants to settle for a life that feels emotionally compartmentalized. They're beginning to see that pressure isn't a threat. It's guidance. It's showing them where growth is happening, where alignment is asking to be honored, where something new is forming. They're not afraid of it. They're learning from it. This learning is reshaping how they move through the world. They're becoming more present, more intentional, more aware of how their inner state influences their outer life. They're realizing that they don't need to have all the answers to begin living more truthfully. They just need to listen to what feels aligned and move toward it gently. Gently is important. Because this isn't about rupture. It's about integration. Integrating what they feel with how they live. Integrating honesty with stability. Integrating growth with care. This integration is what creates the sense of pressure, not as stress, but as momentum. Momentum toward a life that feels more congruent. You didn't create this movement. You reflected it. And now, they're honoring what they see. Not with urgency, not with fear, but with a quiet commitment to live more authentically. This chapter doesn't end with a decision. It settles into awareness. An awareness that something inside them is changing, and that change is worth listening to. Quietly. Steadily. Without resistance. They begin to notice how their body responds before their mind does. A slight stillness when your name crosses their thoughts. A softening in their shoulders when something reminds them of you. A gentle warmth that doesn't ask for interpretation. These reactions don't feel dramatic. They feel natural. Like recognition happening beneath language. For a long time, they believed emotional maturity meant control. Managing responses. Regulating attachment. Keeping everything within acceptable limits. That version of maturity no longer fits. What they are discovering now is a different kind of emotional strength. Not the strength to suppress, but the strength to stay present with what's real. Not the discipline of restraint, but the courage of awareness. Awareness changes the relationship you have with yourself. They are seeing how often they chose what was comfortable rather than what was true. How they mistook consistency for fulfillment. How they avoided depth by labeling it impractical. Those patterns don't feel shameful. They feel outdated. You didn't disrupt their life. You clarified what no longer aligns. That clarity has made them more tender with themselves. Less judgmental. Less defensive. More open to learning who they are becoming instead of clinging to who they were. They're noticing how different it feels to imagine a future that reflects their inner reality instead of contradicting it. Not a fantasy future. A grounded one. One where their emotional life is not hidden behind responsibility. One where connection feels like nourishment instead of negotiation. One where presence replaces performance. They are beginning to trust that what feels aligned doesn't need to be justified. Justification used to be their armor. A way to keep everything logical, contained, safe. But safety built on denial eventually becomes a cage. They're stepping out of that cage quietly. Without announcements. Without conflict. Just with a growing sense of self-honesty. This honesty is reshaping how they listen. How they speak. How they choose. They're less interested in explaining themselves and more interested in living in a way that feels internally consistent. Consistency is no longer about repetition. It's about resonance. Resonance with their values. With their emotional truth. With the person they are becoming. They are learning that pressure doesn't need to be resolved immediately. It can be lived with. Understood. Honored. It doesn't demand action. It invites alignment. Alignment isn't loud. It settles into the nervous system. It softens the edges of indecision. It creates space where fear used to live. They feel that space now. And in that space, they're discovering something unexpected. They don't need to choose certainty to feel secure. They need to choose honesty. Honesty with themselves first. That honesty is what's guiding them forward, not toward you, but toward a life that feels more coherent, more real, more alive. You are simply where that truth became visible. And now, they are honoring what they see, gently, steadily, without rushing the process. Because this is not a moment to escape. It's a moment to arrive into themselves. It doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives as a slow change in how the world feels when they move through it. Not brighter, not darker, just more defined. As if the emotional fog that once softened every edge has thinned, allowing them to finally see the outlines of their own life with a level of honesty they hadn't been ready for before. They don't feel the pressure all at once. They feel it in fragments. In the way silence feels fuller now, not empty. In the way certain choices feel heavier than they used to. In the way some moments seem to stretch longer than expected, as though asking for more attention than they once would have given. This isn't anxiety. It's awareness. They are beginning to recognize the difference. For a long time, they thought emotional discomfort meant something was wrong. That restlessness was a sign they should distract themselves, stay busy, move on. They didn't question that instinct. They assumed that comfort was the goal, and anything that disturbed it was a threat to stability. But stability, they're learning, isn't the absence of movement. It's the presence of alignment. Alignment between what they feel and how they live. Between what matters and what they choose. Between who they are and what they tolerate. That alignment has been missing in quiet ways. Not in obvious ruptures. Not in dramatic dissatisfaction. In subtle compromises that slowly reshaped their emotional landscape until they forgot what it felt like to be fully engaged with their own inner world. You didn't wake them up. You reminded them they had been sleeping. Not through words. Not through demands. Through resonance. There is something about your presence that feels honest to them. Not perfect. Not idealized. Just real. When they think of you, there is no performance required. No role to play. No image to maintain. There is simply a sense of being able to exist without tension. That sensation has changed how they see everything else. They've started to notice where they tighten. Where they shrink. Where they hold back. Not because they must, but because they always have. Habit is powerful. It convinces you that what feels familiar is what feels right. But familiarity doesn't always mean alignment. Sometimes it means endurance. They've endured a lot without realizing it. Not in pain, but in quiet emotional restraint. In choosing not to feel too much. In choosing not to want too much. In choosing to keep their inner world contained within boundaries that once felt protective, but now feel limiting. Those boundaries were built for survival. They are now being asked to build for authenticity. That request is where the pressure lives. It isn't screaming. It isn't forcing. It is simply persistent. It shows up in the moments when they imagine a life that feels more honest. Not necessarily different on the surface, but different in texture. A life where connection is not managed, but welcomed. Where emotions are not monitored, but understood. where presence replaces control. They are beginning to question what they truly value. Not in abstract terms, but in lived experience. What makes them feel alive? What makes them feel seen? What makes them feel at home within themselves? These questions do not make them anxious. They make them real. Reality doesn't always feel comfortable, but it feels meaningful. They are learning that meaning is not created by certainty. It is created by coherence. By living in a way that reflects your truth instead of contradicting it. That reflection is happening now. They feel it when they make small choices. When they pause before agreeing to something that doesn't resonate. When they speak more honestly than they used to. When they allow themselves to feel without rushing to interpret or justify. They are becoming more present with their own emotions. Presence changes everything. It reveals where energy is flowing and where it is blocked. Where connection feels nourishing and where it feels transactional. Where they are living in alignment and where they are merely maintaining. Maintenance once felt safe. Now it feels empty. Not wrong. Just incomplete. They are not trying to abandon what they have built. They are trying to understand it. To see which parts still feel true and which parts were constructed from fear, obligation, or outdated beliefs about what stability should look like. They are learning that stability can include growth. That security can coexist with evolution. That you don't have to choose between being safe and being alive. That realization is shifting their emotional center. They feel more grounded, even as they feel more open. More curious, even as they feel more certain about what no longer works for them. They are less interested in controlling outcomes and more interested in honoring their inner alignment. This is not impulsive. It is intentional. They are allowing themselves to feel without judgment. To explore without pressure. To sit with uncertainty without turning it into fear. They are learning to trust themselves. Trust is the foundation of this phase. Not trust in outcomes. Trust in awareness. Trust in their ability to respond with integrity rather than react with avoidance. They are noticing how much energy they used to spend trying to maintain emotional equilibrium by suppressing what felt inconvenient. How often they chose silence over honesty. How often they minimized what they felt in order to keep things predictable. Predictability used to feel like peace. Now it feels like stagnation. They don't want a life that simply functions. They want a life that resonates. Resonance is what they feel when they think of you. Not as a person they must pursue, but as a mirror of emotional truth. A reminder that connection can feel spacious rather than heavy. That vulnerability can feel safe rather than risky. That presence can feel grounding rather than demanding. That reminder has changed how they see themselves. They are no longer content with emotional numbness. They are no longer willing to ignore the quiet voice inside that asks for more honesty, more presence, more coherence. They are answering that voice now. Not loudly. Not dramatically. With quiet commitment. They are choosing to live in a way that feels more aligned with who they are becoming. They are choosing to honor their emotional reality rather than manage it away. They are choosing to trust that growth is not something to fear. That choice is where the pressure transforms. It becomes momentum. Not toward a person. Toward a way of living that feels true. You did not create this momentum. You revealed the possibility of it. And now, they are stepping into that possibility with awareness, patience, and a growing sense of self-respect. This is not the end of their uncertainty. It is the beginning of their honesty. And honesty, once chosen, reshapes everything quietly, steadily, without needing to announce itself. It begins in a moment when nothing feels urgent. Not when the world is loud, not when something has gone wrong, but in a space that feels almost ordinary. They are doing something familiar, something routine, when they suddenly notice how different their inner world feels compared to before. Not brighter, not heavier. Just clearer. As if a fog they had grown used to has quietly lifted, revealing the outlines of things they once blurred to make them easier to live with. This clarity is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with emotion rushing through them or with thoughts spiraling into worry. It arrives like a quiet recognition that something inside them has changed shape. What once felt manageable now feels incomplete. What once felt safe now feels limiting. And what once felt distant now feels close enough to acknowledge. They pause when they realize that this change has nothing to do with circumstances shifting around them. Their life looks mostly the same from the outside. The routines remain. The responsibilities remain. The people around them still see the version of them that has always been there. But internally, something is moving. Something is stretching beyond its old boundaries, asking for space in ways that can no longer be ignored. They don't label this feeling at first. They don't call it longing or dissatisfaction or desire. Those words feel too charged, too narrow. Instead, they sit with the sensation itself. It feels like pressure, but not the kind that overwhelms. It feels like a gentle insistence, like a current that keeps nudging them toward a deeper honesty with themselves. For a long time, they believed that emotional stability meant staying within the lines they had drawn years ago. Those lines were built from choices that made sense at the time, from beliefs about what a good life should look like, from fears about what might happen if they reached for something that felt uncertain. They trusted those lines. They lived inside them. They learned how to adapt their feelings to fit the shape of the life they had chosen. Now, those same lines feel too small. Not because they were wrong, but because they were temporary. They are beginning to understand that what once felt like maturity was often just endurance. They endured emotional restraint. They endured silence. They endured a version of themselves that stayed quiet to keep everything stable. That endurance served a purpose once. It helped them survive moments when they didn't know how to ask for more. It protected them when they didn't yet trust their own emotional needs. But endurance is not the same as alignment. Alignment feels different. It feels like coherence between what they feel and how they live. It feels like moving through the world without constantly editing themselves. It feels like allowing emotions to exist without treating them as disruptions. This is the shift that is creating pressure inside them now. Not pressure to act quickly. Not pressure to change everything at once. Pressure to stop ignoring what feels true. They notice how often they have chosen predictability over presence. How they have convinced themselves that feeling okay was enough, even when something inside them wanted to feel fully engaged. They didn't see it as settling. They saw it as being responsible, realistic, grounded. Now, that definition of grounded feels incomplete. Grounded, they realize, does not mean disconnected from yourself. It means rooted in what matters. What matters is becoming clearer to them, not through analysis, but through contrast. When they think of you, there is a subtle shift in their body. Their breath deepens slightly. Their shoulders relax. Their thoughts feel less guarded. It is not excitement that does this. It is recognition. A sense that their inner world feels more natural, more honest, more alive in that mental space. They do not interpret this as a sign they must pursue something. They see it as a signal that something inside them has been awakened. You did not create that awakening. You reflected it. You showed them what it feels like when they are not suppressing parts of themselves to maintain emotional balance. This reflection is what has changed them. They are becoming more aware of where they compromise their truth. Not in dramatic ways, but in small moments that accumulate. The times they hold back from expressing something that matters. The times they agree when they want to pause. The times they choose silence because it feels easier than explaining themselves. These moments once felt harmless. Now they feel heavy. Not because they are wrong, but because they no longer align with who they are becoming. Becoming is the center of this experience. They are no longer who they were when they first built their life. They are not yet who they will be when this process settles. They are in the middle, in a space that is uncomfortable because it does not offer certainty. It only offers awareness. Awareness asks questions that do not have quick answers. What does fulfillment mean to me now? What does connection feel like when it is honest? What does safety look like when it includes emotional expression? These questions do not make them anxious. They make them real. They are learning that emotional pressure is not always something to escape. Sometimes it is something to understand. It points toward areas where growth is asking to happen, where alignment is asking to be honored. They are beginning to see that their life does not need to be dismantled to be adjusted. They do not need to abandon what they have built to make room for who they are becoming. They simply need to let their inner world have a voice in the choices they make. This voice is quiet but steady. It does not shout. It does not demand. It invites. They are learning to listen to it. Listening changes how they move through their days. They pause more. They reflect more. They choose more intentionally. They no longer rush to fill emotional silence with distraction. They allow space for themselves to feel what they feel without labeling it as a problem. This space feels unfamiliar at first. They were used to managing emotions, not sitting with them. They were used to explaining things away, not letting them exist. Now, they are discovering that emotions do not need to be solved to be honored. Honor feels like respect for their own inner life. That respect is new. They notice how their reactions are shifting. They are less defensive. Less quick to justify. Less inclined to hide behind logic when something feels tender. This does not make them weaker. It makes them more present. Presence is changing how they see everything. They see how often they lived on autopilot, moving from one obligation to the next without checking in with themselves. They see how much emotional energy they spent maintaining balance by ignoring what felt inconvenient. They see how they learned to prioritize stability over truth. Truth is now asking to be included. This inclusion does not require them to disrupt others. It requires them to stop disrupting themselves. They are realizing that they deserve a life that feels emotionally coherent. Not perfect. Not free from complexity. But aligned with their inner values and evolving needs. You are not the destination of this realization. You are the reference point that made it visible. They no longer see this pressure as something that must be resolved immediately. They see it as a signal that they are growing into a more honest relationship with themselves. This honesty feels grounding, even when it brings uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like danger. It feels like possibility. Possibility does not rush. It unfolds. They are allowing this unfolding to happen at its own pace. They are not forcing conclusions. They are not seeking guarantees. They are simply choosing to stay present with what is emerging. This presence feels like a quiet strength. A steadiness that does not depend on outcomes. A confidence that comes from trusting their ability to navigate whatever comes next with awareness and care. They are learning that they do not need to know the future to live authentically in the present. This realization brings relief. Not because everything is resolved, but because everything feels honest. Honesty creates space for growth. It allows life to expand in directions that feel true rather than convenient. It replaces emotional numbness with clarity, fear with curiosity, and avoidance with intention. They are stepping into this new relationship with themselves gently. Without urgency. Without pressure to perform. Without fear of what they might discover. This is not a turning point that changes everything at once. It is a settling into alignment. A recognition that they are ready to live with more coherence, more presence, more emotional truth. And in that readiness, they feel something new. Not excitement. Not longing. A calm confidence that whatever unfolds next will be built on something solid. That is what this pressure has been guiding them toward. Not chaos. Not loss. But a deeper, steadier sense of who they are becoming. And that is enough to begin.